So good morning. This is the weekly VOLTHA TST meeting. We have a few people on, light crowd today, but we should be able to go through everything pretty quickly. So an announcement was made today in VOLTHA Discuss about the open broadband meetup in Istanbul. Registration's now open. I'll dig up the URL for the email for the news group in a bit, but you basically visit the URL and you can go register if you're ready to go. I don't think Denise is on, but she had a request to email marketing if anybody was interested in sponsoring the event. So I'm sure we'll cover this again next week. So updates. Let me see. I don't think Jan is on. I can give you some high-level updates for his items. I'll leave it in the agenda, though, because he can go into more detail with this. So in the CI management, the repository CI management are all of the pipeline definitions and the configs and the scripts for running the Jenkins job pipelines. So Jan has gone and made a change within the Jenkins job builder configs that's going to be beneficial going forward. The setup we were previously using was based on a DSL structure, which are basically you write Jenkins jobs in terms of tokens. And that setup basically made static copies of the jobs and the scripts and everything. So we had a few problems where you could go in, update sources in the CI management repository, and unless you got all of the files together that were needed, the jobs that were generated, or sometimes jobs were not generated, so you could end up running with stale copies of the scripts. So Jan has changed the configs so that we're now pulling sources directly from source control. So jobs are basically running dynamically with whatever, with what's checked into the master branch or what versions of the code has been released. So that's going to be a good change. There has been some updates on the Berlin hardware test or the lab testing for the community jobs in Berlin. Sorry, let me just pull this up. I know there's been quite a few test cleanups. I'm not completely familiar with everything that's gone in, but we don't have a lot of status. There should be a lot more green showing up in here because I know they've been addressing quite a few of the problems. But again, we can wait for wait for when Jan is on again next time to go into it deeper. Does anybody have any? I know this is very high level. Does anybody have any questions or anything you'd like to bring up? Okay. So next we can dive into an update for BBSim, and I was working on a patch for Nikesh recently. He was having some problems with the Helm charts. I'm thinking we might have identified one of the more annoying transient failure sources in the system. Some of it's been fixed, some of it still needs to be researched, but basically there was a failure that manifested in the OpenOLT adapter sanity test, when we were launching BBSim tests. So part of when the job runs, we launch a script called VOLTHA stack, install VOLTHA stack.groovy. We install the VOLTHA stack Helm chart, we install the VOLTHA infra stack, and then launch the Kubernetes cluster to start running tests. One thing that turned up in this script, the logic we were using we basically launched some kubectl commands or do the installation, then run a while loop to start polling to see what status the cluster, verify the cluster started up. Once the status is captured, then we progress along, to the next steps. What I've been finding, the logic that was being used to perform the testing was actually just checking for activity from the cluster. It wasn't actually, it didn't seem to be verifying that the cluster actually started. Now, I've been finding some other peripheral details where some of the clusters are taking a while to start up. We'll start seeing crash back off, a crash loop back off, which we try to start a service, it fails, and Kubernetes keeps trying until things start up properly. In addition to crash backup loop, I've been seeing some errors, service errors show up. The combinations of these require extra time for the cluster to start up. We need to look into why these things are taking so long, but generally what's happening is because we didn't wait for the cluster to start fully, we basically would check for any activity, and once the activity was detected, we would progress on. If the cluster is not started, or if we do not wait for the cluster to start, you're in a state where we can begin testing or checking for port forwarding or things like that. Like, in fact, here's one of the failures that showed up. If the cluster's not fully started, we can't really launch port forwarding against it or do anything with it. So I'm seeing this as one of the transient failures that have been going on because we progressed when the cluster hadn't initialized properly, and later on it's kind of a race condition if we can begin testing because everything started properly. So some changes went into the VOLTHA, the stack deploy, or the install VOLTHA stack logic. We actually have a polling loop, a proper polling loop in here now, so that we can get different states in the polling loop. We can get the container for the services being created. It may be running, it may be error. I found a couple of other states as well. But the logic that's in here right now doesn't simply test for activity. We first capture the state of the server. There's some debugging in here that every minute or so, we actually output the state that was captured into the log so you can see what's actually going on, crash back off loop or running or any of that. But we go through and poll for individual states. If the container's creating, we continue and continue looping. This is the original loop grep for 0/ in the output, which was this guy right here. This is the initial test for activity. Yeah. Sorry, I know I'm going too far down into the weeds. I'll try and speed this up a little bit. But if we test that there's activity going on, we continue looping until the running state is achieved. There's a corner case. We have to make sure that we're actually getting output from the cluster. We do an explicit test for error, and we'll fail with, I've got to inline a call to get kubectl logs in here. So if we hit the error state, we'll actually capture logs in the Jenkins log, and we can see what's going on. So after all of this state polling, if there are no errors, there is activity, everything seems to be running, that's the exit condition to assume that the cluster is working properly. So we actually wait for status now. This has seemed to help some of the failure conditions quite a bit. There was a second, this failure manifested as timeout because the retries are taking so long. I've been finding the OLT service has been taking upwards of 2 to 2.5 minutes for the cluster to get to a running state. When we started waiting for proper status and we knew the cluster was running, downstream there was another while loop that was testing for this 0/ activity condition. That actually threw the while loop into an infinite loop because the cluster is up and running when we exit this loop, so there's no way this activity state will exist in the cluster. So this polling loop was also added to the downstream piece, that the downstream polling loop that was failing. Right now, these are the logs from Kubernetes that's contributing to this error condition. I've got to try and figure out where this is coming from. We're getting a failed to sync config map cache, so that's the current error. I know that's a lot of detail. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? The takeaway is basically we have a real polling loop around the cluster initialization now, and the job will no longer exit early when the cluster is in an unknown state. There's some other problems going on, but I think this is going to take care of a lot of the strange port forwarding errors and other things because the cluster was not fully functional. Okay, if there's no questions. This Onos config loader timeout. This is just the second place the polling loop failure manifested. We timed out after 10 minutes, and that was because the Onos config loader test was actually running when we tried to see if there was any activity, and we checked for 0/1, which it's just an infinite loop, so that failed. And that's been fixed as well. One oddity in all of this, as I mentioned, if anybody wants to look into this as well, feel free, but it's from some anecdotal review of the logs, it looks like the OpenOLT adapter seems to be where the crash backoff loops and the errors are manifesting. Well, this one had ONU as well, but combined, that's what's contributing to the 2+ minute startup, which ends up the job's timeout when we exceed the 10-minute startup. So that's the 10 minutes is a combination of the job activity up until we start trying to launch the VOLTHA stack. Yeah, and that's just more of the same. But this is just detail for the ticket that that showed up or that's been debugged. So that's basically all of this. What I just talked about. The polling loop has changed, downstream failures, failed initial attempts to launch service and crash back off. Nikesh also had a failure with Helm chart checking. This just turned up, but it's starting to look like there's a similar problem with the polling loop. Nikesh's job, I've run it a recheck against his patch twice. It passed the first time and it failed the second time. And this time an image pull back off was recorded. I've not seen this before. This is the first instance I've seen this from the Kubernetes cluster. But again, these retries contributed to the 10-minute timeout, which ultimately caused the job to fail. So that's being looked at as well. I don't believe this is Nikesh's patch is actually contributing to this. It's going to be something in the state of the cluster, the services that are running or any of that. And Nikesh also had a code review request in. If I need to go in and look at it as well, but if anybody has cycles to review the Helm chart changes, feel free. Lastly, just for some release items, I've been trying to create epics for like the failures I've been digging into with BBSim. That's this Kubernetes stuff as of late. There's some Helm chart problems that are showing up. Nikesh's ticket was in with those. Just trying to capture them into a more manageable set that we can go through and target and try and get them resolved. I guess, does anybody have any questions about any of this? I know this is all a lot of this is infrastructure and digging into problems. If there's no questions, the floor is open if anybody would like to cover any topics. I know there's quite a few patches in Garrett right now up for review. So if people have time to go through and look at those, that would be good as well. And side note on the Kubernetes problems, I have been talking to Mahir about them as well. He's also helping look into the problem sources for those. Okay, I guess if nobody has any questions, and we have no other topics to discuss, let me see. Let me just do a quick pass here. Yeah, we can cover the hardware testing next week. And I guess that's a wrap then. Wow, short meeting today, 20 minutes. Well, thanks for stopping by, and we can pick this up again next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Yep.
You.
Yes.